All right, so grateful that you guys are with us this afternoon. I'm so grateful to be here. My name's Rodney Anderson. I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking to two of my good friends, John and Teesha. And these two have written a book that came out in March called Black and White, and just kind of chronicling their experience and their friendship and growing up with racism and what their friendship has produced. And I'm so glad that you guys are going to get to know them. And I think it's just so important. I think it's so effective when two people of different backgrounds and different ethnicities come together for one common purpose. I just feel like what comes out of that is so much more effective. So thank you for writing a book. I've never written one, and I hear it's really difficult. So thanks for making it happen.
Fools rush in where angels fear to tread.
It's great. Love that,
Did you just
John.
make that up just now? Or is that a thing? Is that a song or something?
Don't ask me those questions.
Okay, sorry.
Well, so thanks for writing it. And, John and Teesha, obviously, we know you guys do not speak on the collective behalf of your entire race. But just know you're representing everybody right now. So real quick.
Oh, good.
Well, we've gotten off to a great start here.
Let's just jump in. We just kind of just share a little bit about your background, how you kind of grew up, and if you can, just kind of your first experience, memory in dealing with, race and ethnicity, positive or negative.
Sure. John, you want to start?
Sure. So, third generation Southern Californian, grew up early part of elementary school in Reseda, which is a suburb of Los Angeles. And a great family, great school, church was okay, but we were isolated. And so, growing up, I was not taught to think badly about black people. I was basically taught not to think about black people at all. And even though, as the crow flies, we were 20 miles away from Watts, when I was a little boy, Dr. King was in the middle of his public ministry that had nothing to do with our life, at least not in a way that we could perceive. So I was isolated ethnically. That changed when I went to school. I went to Pepperdine in Malibu and met a man named Bobby Heron. He was the only black surfer I ever met. I surfed all through middle school, high school, and college. And Bobby and I became friends, so we started surfing together. And he, I was just another blonde-haired white surfer. Some things have changed. And so nobody cared how I surfed. But when Bobby was in the water, he said, "John, I feel like I'm in a freak show," because everybody in the water would say, "Oh my gosh, there's a black guy out in the water." They weren't hostile, but they were just curious. And so when Bobby was catching a wave, it was like he was on TV. Everybody was watching him. And it really took away from his enjoyment of the sport. And so all that to say, and then since then, God has brought some amazing people who don't look like me into my life. I got to spend a week with Dr. Perkins back in the 1980s. Lots of other people, and then of course Teesha. But what I want to tell you is my story can be summed up this way. I did not start to care about black people until I cared about a black person. And God used that to open the door and change my life.
Yeah, thanks for that, John. I would say my experience was a little bit different. I grew up in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. That's home for me. And if you've ever been to that part of the country, then you know that it's a very diverse part of the country, very international, racially, ethnically diverse. So it's always been a part of my experience to be around people who are different from me. That's never been strange, that's never been odd or novel for me. I remember in high school, I was on the debate team, and whatever assumptions you want to make about me as being a high school debater, those are probably accurate, so feel free to make those. And so I was on the high school debate team, and we would go to these competitions that were predominantly white, but my high school was very diverse. So any black competitors that were at these competitions were typically from my high school. And inevitably, I would go to a competition, and after I would compete, some parent or judge would come up to me and say, "Oh, you are so articulate." See, y'all are laughing because that has happened to you before. And so I don't think that there was anything sinister in what they were saying, but what they tacitly were communicating is that because of the color of my skin, there was something surprising about the fact that I had a command of the English language, although it is in fact my first language. So that was sort of my experience of race. Although I grew up always around people who are different, and that's very normal for me, I couldn't escape the reality that my race was, you know, central and like part of my experience as I was going about life and in the world. And so I didn't have the luxury that John had of not attending to or paying attention to my race or the race of others.
So you guys grew up completely different.
Completely different.
Yeah. White, surfer, maybe the occasional drug use.
Oh my gosh, we didn't agree on that.
I said maybe.
Yeah, right.
No comment. Oh gosh, poor John.
Wow.
We'll keep
I didn't know
going.
this was going to be an intervention.
Florida. Florida, total opposite coast, debate team, very diverse. How did you guys become friends? I mean, it's you guys are kind of like an odd couple in a lot of ways. So how did you guys become friends? And how did you begin to write this book together?
That's a good question.
So, we both write. I've written stuff before, and I wanted to write something about racism and race because that was so important. It had become so important to me. So I approached the publisher who published my first book, and I said, I'd like to write about this. And they said, well, this would be much more interesting, old white guy, if you would write this with somebody who didn't look like you. And it took me about, not long at all to think, well, Teesha would be great at that. So I approached her, and the reason I even got to a place where I knew that was because Teesha came to work in the department that I was working in at Buckhead Church, which is where we both worked back then. And so we started working together every day. And that's how we met. And, at first, we just had a professional relationship, but slowly we began to know and trust each other. And slowly our relationship started to be much more than just coworkers. To that point, Teesha met her husband in my office.
I did.
He proposed to her in my office.
That's a fact.
And I officiated at their wedding under a live oak tree in a vineyard in Central California.
Yeah.
So our...
Aw, y'all are so cute.
So it's just a wonderful relationship. And what we discovered is this trust and goodwill that built up between us held when we started to talk about the difficult subject of racism. And if you know white people, we're scared to talk about that with black people for the most part. And so it was nervous at first, but our respect, our enjoyment of each other, and our commitment to be kind but honest held. And so that was why when they said, you should write this book with somebody who doesn't look like you, that was why I immediately thought of Teesha.
Yeah, I think what we've discovered is that what can often be missing when people talk about friendship across difference is that there can be talking about actually a very thin sense of community, a very thin sense of friendship. But what we have found is that we're not talking about just kind of go and have one coffee with one person, right? We're talking about deep and lasting connection to one another, in such that it's characterized by mutual obligation, right? If you have a sibling, for example, and someone is harming your brother or your sister, there's no doubt in your mind in that moment that you have an obligation to comfort them and also to bring an end to their suffering, right? I mean, think in your mind about your brother or your sister, and you know that intuitively. And as Christians, we talk about each other as brothers and sisters in Christ, but you have to question whether or not we actually believe that is true in the way that we treat one another. And so that's what I think has been key in my friendship with John, is really the sense of mutual obligation and mutual commitment to one another.
Correct me if I'm wrong, you didn't want to write this book initially when John approached you. You were like, I don't want to do this. And then what got you over the hump?
She never told me that.
That's not true, John. I mean, there were practical reasons. I mean, was in grad school and trying to, balance time and things like that.
Newly married.
Newly married. I think I'm still newly married. How long does that last?
That's not why we're here to talk
Okay,
about.
sorry. But I think the other piece of it was that I just had some concern about writing a book that did not take seriously the challenges and complexities and the ugliness of the problem of race. I did not want to write a book that sought to approach that in any sort of a soft way. But I wanted to be sure to still tell the truth about the fruit out of our friendship and our relationship. And so I think that we have tried to and desired to strike that balance in the book in talking about the ugliness of systemic and personal racism, the difficulties that exist in friendships like ours, but also that has a sense of hope that's rooted in our common belief in Jesus Christ as Lord.
Yeah, I want to follow up that with a question just 1 second before
Sure.
I do. John, you mentioned, and I think this is important, the fear that white people have to talk about this. There's a lot of fear in culture to talk about it. There's a lot of fear that you're going to get something wrong. There's a lot of fear you're going to offend someone. There's a lot of fear that you are going to sound ignorant, that you're going to say something that used to be okay but now is no longer okay, or vice versa. Do you find, and have you guys found in talking about this, do you see that fear exists just as much in church as it does in culture?
I think it exists more in church. I think that's because you know what? I think it's because church people inexplicably have failed to breathe in God's grace, and still, I would contend most people in the American church are still living under the law. I would say they still think, if I behave myself, if I do the right thing, God will bless me. If I don't, he will withdraw that blessing. And I think because we have failed to breathe in God's grace, it has made the kind of discussions that we've had even scarier.
What do you think?
I would add a couple of things. I think part of it also, the reason that these conversations, I agree with John that these conversations are more difficult in the church, but part of that is because of a failure to tell the truth, right? I mean, we mentioned earlier, that I'm married, and so if you think about if my husband has wronged me in some way and is thereafter unable to state clearly the contours of the wrong thing that he has done, well, we're going to have some problems, are we not? There's going to be some distance, some disconnect between us. And so there's been a failure of truth-telling within the church, which I think, and so the difficulty of having these conversations in the church is the fruit of that. But it's also, there's a fear, I notice, of late of being political. Let me square myself in my chair.
What's going to happen?
I don't want to fall out of it.
Oh, okay.
Which is a certain kind of folly. Because we forget when we make that claim or express that fear that Jesus Christ was executed by the state as a criminal and a rabble-rouser. Friends, the crucifixion is political. And so what we have done then is we have begun to confuse what is political with what is partisan. And so what that means is that things that should not at all be controversial among Christians at all for any reason are suddenly partisan and incredibly controversial. And so what we have to do is we have to continue, I believe, to preach the coming of the kingdom of God. We have to continue to preach release of the captives. We have to continue to preach freedom for the oppressed, regardless of how controversial that is. Partisanship cannot inform what it is that we say from the pulpit or how it is that we live our lives as people of faith.
That's good. It's so crazy that being labeled a Democrat or Republican can silence you from issues of justice.
Right.
It's so unfair.
And by unfair, you mean a ridiculous.
Yeah, that word works. That word works. So bringing back up what you said a second ago, because I wanted to follow back up, because you said you didn't want to write something where it did not address the actual issues of race and racism that we see. I mean, we see police shootings, we see hate crimes that are going up. We see the police called just because someone walked in to use the restroom in a Starbucks. We see all kinds of issues and things happening. But yet at the heart of your book, it is how friendship can disrupt racism. Does friendship come across too soft? I mean, is it with all the hard issues, it feels like friendship is this Pollyanna kind of way to enforce and deal with the real problems of racism.
Yeah.
Well, we hear that critique, and we would go back to the 1960s when the civil rights movement was operating and changing the world. They talked about friendship. Jim Lawson, the conceptual architect of much of what was going on back then, the civil rights movement, he talked about the beloved community. Martin Luther King, in his oft-quoted speech on the Mall in Washington, D.C., talked about an end result where people were friends together with no fear, with no expectation otherwise. So we would say our emphasis on friendship has connected with what we have been about in the civil rights movement for the past 50 years. And furthermore, we would say that in a country that is so severely polarized, so severely torn in half, that friendship takes on an added strategic value that is essential if we are going to make any progress. But as Teesha's going to say right now, it doesn't stop with friendship.
Oh, now I'm supposed to say it, sorry. I thought you were going to keep going. Right, I mean, I think part of it is it's a bit of a false choice, I think, to say that we have to choose either friendship or sort of direct, more political action. Because what we're looking at is a long-standing, deeply rooted, incredibly complex problem. And so it's important that we actually attack it from various angles and in various ways. And so, yes, it would be very Pollyannish if we were to sit up here and say, all you have to do is go and just be friends and everything will be fixed. But I couldn't even possibly say that with a straight face. I mean, it would be silly. And so we would never argue that. And so what we're saying is that it is an essential place to begin, and it is a place from which God can then use you, can then use this new friendship, this new community to go out, and where God will send you out then to do the further work, the additional work of addressing systems of racism.
And then the other thing, you've noticed we have kind of a playful relationship. There's a time to weep.
Yeah,
there is a time to be angry. There is a time to mourn and lament. But there is also a time to goof around together. Mm-hmm. There is a time where we should enjoy each other's company. If we expect to lead our country in this battle against racial injustice, we have to show them a well-rounded relationship. It can't always be serious. It can't always be playful. It's got to be real. We think that contains the greatest promise for us to be real and authentic and enjoy each other's company, in addition to talking about the hard topics like systemic racism. Yeah. So if you're wondering why are they goofing around so much, it's because this is who we are, and we think it's important to be who we are if we're going to make any progress. Mm-hmm.
You're just talking about bringing the entire human experience to the relationship and how much that matters, all the emotions and everything, and doing life with someone else that's different. That doesn't feel soft. That feels like it's really making a difference. Switching to the church for a little bit, because I know you guys are passionate about the church's role in dealing with this. First, you guys get this question a lot, so I just want to ask, should you guys think the church collectively should be diverse? Should all churches be diverse?
Well, so I think it's important to remember that the black church, the first black denomination, the AME Church, was started when Richard Allen and his friend Absalom Jones both were at their home church, their own church, praying on their knees when they were asked to relocate to a different area of the church, on their knees, and pulled off their knees, physically removed then from where they were in the church. And they left the church that day and decided that they needed to start something different, that they needed to form a place where black people could exist in the full life and leadership of the church and worship God in authenticity. And the reality is that there's still a need for such spaces, right? So we would never sit here and say, oh, the black church has no further utility or use in our country. I think that would be incredibly short-sighted. But some people desire to be in a multi-ethnic church. We are two such people, right? Some people desire that. Some people have a sense of call to that. Some people want their community, their church to reflect the community, which is probably a pretty good rule of thumb. And if your community is multi-ethnic, then it makes sense that you would desire for your church to look like the community in which it is situated. But, you know, you didn't ask me this, but I'm going to answer a question you didn't ask because that's what I like to do sometimes. You know, a lot of times when people think about diversifying their church or shifting the makeup of their church, right? They think first about sort of the cosmetic things. How do we make the musicians diverse? How do we make the pictures on social media look diverse? How do we do these like outward-facing things? And those things are important, they're good, right? But it's not nearly enough. You actually have to begin with the leadership. You have to begin with the leadership, the places where the decisions are made. The reality is that if you are interested in having a black person, a person of color in leadership or in your church without power, then you have a token. You have to be willing then to allow people to bring their whole selves, their stories, their pain, their joys to bear on the organization. If you are unwilling to do that, then you really are just putting lipstick on a pig. And I don't eat pork. So, I do actually, but it was funny. So I think you have to be prepared to invite people to the table to hold actual power and make decisions so that you can begin to shift the DNA, the ethos of the church from the inside out, if you really want to have a true multi-ethnic community.
And we would argue if the table where decisions are being made, whether it's a church or a company or a baseball team or whatever, if that doesn't become diverse, then the cosmetic diversity that occurs in the auditorium or the sanctuary will only be temporary.
Yeah, that's good.
So what's the opportunity that you guys see before the church to help in this regard? What do you see?
Tons of opportunity. First of all, because racism is not solely held in place by human forces. There are evil powers at work sustaining racism in our country, in the world. One of the great opportunities for the church, what was that?
I don't know, it sounded like an air horn.
Yeah, was that? Okay, that's good.
I think we got like 2
good?
minutes.
Okay,
I think that's
we
what
got 2
that
minutes.
was.
Okay, that was a 2-minute warning? Okay, great. Do you like being silly and serious simultaneously? Is that okay with you guys? Okay, because racism foundationally is a spiritual battle, one of the great opportunity of the church is to pray. And the American church stinks at that because we're too busy. So I'm telling myself this, we'll just tell everybody this, if we, and we are, I think we care about this, if we really do care about this, we have to make time to pray. Otherwise, the scriptures say not much will happen.
Yeah.
The second thing, our country has lost its moral compass. There is a vacuum there. That's a huge opportunity for the church. But we're not going to get there with our words. We are going to get there with our willingness to sacrificially suffer. And could I just tell you, that scares the tar out of me. But therein lies the opportunity. If we're willing to live that way, I believe our country will be impacted.
Yeah. I think the other piece of it is that racism really flies in the face of just one of the most core and central aspects of Christian doctrine, which is that we are all, every single person, from every person in this room, every person out there, every person on the border, every person born in another country, every person in the White House, is created by God and made in the image of God. And so there is then an opportunity to live into that core aspect of the Christian faith. Because the reality is that as we sit by and allow racism to flourish, the very character of God is at stake. The very character of who we are as human beings is at risk, right? And so I think there's an opportunity to be clear and forthright about who God is and who we are and what God is up to as we tackle and seek to bring about racial justice.
Oh, that's good. I think I read one time in a book, Bowling Alone, Robert Putnam said something along the lines of, people are mistaken when they think diversity is a strength. So diversity by itself is not a strength, but diversity united behind a common cause and a common reason, then it becomes a strength. And so when I think you've got the church united under the banner and the mandate of Jesus to go and love your neighbor as yourself, it becomes an unstoppable force in the world. So we're wrapping up, but we wanted to give an opportunity for anybody, if you had a few questions about John and Teesha, their story, their book, we could take like 3 or 4 questions, I believe. Yes, you've got the mic right here. So just real quick, 2 things. If you want to ask a question, just keep it short. And the second thing is make sure your question ends in a question. Right? Your voice should go up at the end.
I've chosen some people, David and Naomi. Come up to the front.
Yes, you've got one. Come to Alicia right here.
Gotten some people. You can ask first. Just say your name and then ask me the question.
So my name is Raya, and I just want to know how you got saved.
Oh.
Great question. She asked, she
How
wanted
we
to
got
know
saved.
how you got saved.
Oh, wow. How long do we have?
I thank you for asking that. My part was a 2-part conversion. I got saved at a Billy Graham movie when I was 12. My grandpa took me, and he walked with me down the aisle. And then I grew up in the 60s and 70s in Southern California, completely decided to start to destroy my life. Came back to Jesus when I was 17, right before I went too far. So 2 parts, but Billy Graham and my grandpa helped me to get to know Jesus. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, so thanks for that question. I guess like a lot of people have a praying grandmother who prayed for me and with me and shared the gospel with me early and often and clearly. And but it wasn't until I was somewhere I was in my mid-20s, and I was just at a difficult and kind of low point in my life. And at that point, when I heard the gospel again, it just became alive and like in Technicolor for me in a new and a different way. And that's when I gave my life to Christ. Yeah.
Great question.
Thanks for that.
Hey, y'all. My name's Naomi. My question, speaking of children, and this may not be your scope or anything, but I'm trying to say this nicely. There's a generational difference, clearly,
Yes.
right?
John is older.
Yes. Thank you. There's a generational
We're trying.
difference.
We appreciate you trying to put it delicately, but he needs to hear that.
With age comes wisdom. Thank you.
That's the idea, anyway.
Yes. How do we take, because I know there's some parents in the room, how do we take everything that we're learning and shield our children from the ruthless reality of racism while also sharing the richness of justice and reconciliation? You guys have clearly done that in a very spectacular way, and how would you suggest we do that with generations, that aren't necessarily here but are represented?
Sure.
So I have 2 adult children, and I wish I had a chance to parent them all over again in some ways. I feel like I didn't do great the first time around. But I think shielding our kids is of limited value. Obviously, the younger they are, that needs to be managed, but I would advocate the most important thing we can do for our children, in addition to being parents, is to connect them with mentors that can help them to make sense out of the good things and the bad things that they see. I think mentoring is absolutely crucial to parenting in the 21st century.
Yeah, I think for me, two things. As I look back on my own upbringing, a couple of things that I really appreciate about my mother's own raising of me and my sister is such an attention to, because for young black girls, there needs to be an attention to like saying that you're beautiful, and that your hair is beautiful, and that your skin and your broader nose, like these are beautiful things about you. And so there's some of those like basic things that I think that we can do that I appreciated in my mother's own upbringing of us. But I think there's also just a need to kind of model this for the younger generations, right? It's just allow younger people to see what it looks like to live out a life that is hopeful, but also steadfast and tenacious in your pursuit of justice. Because that's really the tension, I think, right? Is to be sort of steadfastly pursuing a change, a different world, a different way of being, while still holding on to the hope that really is only possible in Christ. Thank you, and thanks for leading worship yesterday. It was so beautiful. Hi, how are you?
Mic check, 1, 2, okay. My name is David, and it was really cool just hearing y'all share. It was really awesome, so thank you for that. Just first a statement, I just really appreciate y'all writing the book together, being different and engaging with each other and things like that. That just seems really cool. I'm a missionary right now, and most of my comrades on my team are white, and I just know, like, being in some countries where, you know, racism is a thing here also, but like just the caste systems and all the injustices overseas in a lot of countries that I go to. But one of the things that has been so effective has been, you know, us being a team of Christians, yes, but just diverse, and our diversity has opened so many doors for the gospel to go forth. Like, I remember being in Lebanon, and a Muslim guy coming up to me, he was just so curious, like, how can most black people in that country are housemates and things like that, and he was just like, how can you be hanging out with them? And it really gave me a chance to share the gospel. But just the question is, how was it in the process of like writing that book and understanding each other's pains and backgrounds? Like, how was that, like, engaging with each other? Like, and have you seen any fruit from that? Like, people just saying, like, this is just an odd relationship type thing, and just seeing that y'all have done that, like, how has that been? Yeah, I just was curious about that.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's been fun.
It's been great, but it's a lot. It requires a lot of hard work,
yeah,
a lot of communication, and a lot of submitting to the opinions and judgments of each other. Mm-hmm. And so it's not quick, it's not easy, but if you're willing to put in the time, be vulnerable, be honest, it's just been a wonderful process.
Yeah, every word in our book is both of us. And that was a challenge because we wanted to bring certainly both of our perspectives to the work, because that's part of what's unique about us having co-authored this book together. But we also wanted the other's perspective to be like brought to bear on, you know, the entire work, or the work as a whole. And so it was challenging. We would have not arguments, like, but we would disagree.
They were arguments. Just say it was
but we would
arguments.
disagree sometimes about language, but we would just have to talk about it. You know, why did I think that this way of saying this, or why this topic had to be in the book, you know? And John would express his perspective, and sometimes we would, you know, agree to disagree, and that thing would stay in, and then we'd say, well, just leave it to the editor. So we had to have a lot of those really difficult conversations, but I think that actually probably speaks to sort of more broadly what's necessary, right? Is kind of the commitment to one another, the commitment to the work, the commitment to our relationship as a whole. And so we knew that we could go into these conversations confident that nothing about what we were going to say in that moment was going to be the undoing of our friendship.
Right. We never lost respect for each other, and we
Yeah.
never lost a strong sense that we were for each other.
Right.
All right.
Thank you.
All right, last question.
Thank you. I really appreciate your presentation and just the authenticity of your relationship. It's beautiful to watch. My question is there was a statement made earlier during the presentation that churches wouldn't necessarily survive or flourish if the leadership is homogeneous and you're trying to get a diversified church. But as we know, most churches are diverse as a result of just one directional assimilation of black and brown people coming into white spaces. So how do you advise or walk homogeneous white leadership into bringing in diverse leadership?
Okay, that's all we have time for.
I think we just heard the horn.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah, the question is like, how do we help white people pull it together?
Is that what we said?
Basically,
not what
that's
I
what I
heard.
got from the question.
Perfect. We could just have an argument right here in front of everybody and see how that
Hey,
goes. You know, at the risk of being predictable, prayer is just so dang important. And if we would just, we all have seen time again, if we're willing to pray about something consistently, intentionally over a long period of time, involving others in our prayer, that just, you know that I heard a great way to, I am tempted to be a functional atheist, where yeah, God's up there, but he doesn't really have a whole lot to do in my life. I have to confess I've lived that way sometimes, but when I've been willing to invite him in, stuff happens. So, short answer to a very important question, but I just think prayer is absolutely crucial. Absolutely crucial.
I think there's also a role for being willing to cast vision for your leadership. I think sometimes there's an assumption like these are the people in leadership, they're the ones in power, they're going to know the best way to do that. But the people sitting in the pew should never assume that they don't have anything to say about the direction of the church, nor should they assume that that what they have to say could not actually impact the direction of the church. So if you're in a church where the congregation is becoming increasingly diverse and the leadership is continuing to be homogenous, I would say, please, you should go and you should have a conversation with your pastor and you should point that out and you should cast a vision for this church, for the leadership, and talk about how there's an incredible opportunity here for your church to lean into this beautiful community that has now found its way into your pews. So don't underestimate your own influence. Don't underestimate your own influence within your churches.
John and Teesha, thank you guys so much.
Thanks, Rodney.
Yeah. You guys are just modeling what the whole world needs to see, right? And just two people who can look into somebody that's different and see the image of God in them, and that makes all the difference in the world if we can see that. It's just the most unlikely of things that was even said, that we're made in the image of God thousands and thousands of years ago. When you look at humanity, look at what we're doing, it's so self-evident that we're so messed up, and then still someone thousands of years ago said, you know what, despite the violence and the sin and the flawed nature of all of us, there's a divine spark. And you guys are modeling that, and thank you for writing your book. John and Teesha are going to be signing copies of their book out in the lobby. Mm-hmm. When?
At 3, or I don't even know what time. At 4.
At 4 o'clock, so they would love to meet you. They'd also love it more if you bought one of their books. So say hey to them, buy one of their books. It's so helpful, and it's also helpful if you're like, I don't need it, I'm totally great, buy it for a friend, because it really is a helpful introduction to how we can move forward as a country and continue to help disrupt racism through friendship. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks, Rodney.